listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Greetings and welcome to another episode of Awake in Relationship. My name is Silas Rose. There's a lot of speculation happening right now about what lies on the other side of this pandemic for us. It's been a really tough year for a lot of people, especially those that live alone or are isolated. But it's also not been easy for those in committed long-term relationships. Many of us are really discovering our boundaries, our edge, the hard way. Boundaries are a natural part of any relationship, but rarely are these discussed openly until a line has been crossed. In this episode of Awake in Relationship, I speak with returning guest Mel Cassidy, a relationship coach with a really unique perspective on particularly complex relationships, about the art of negotiating boundaries and agreements. In this chat, we dive deep into how trauma shows up in intimacy and how to use our somatic experiences to guide our deepest needs and desires in a relationship. So if you're feeling now is the time to have a challenging conversation with someone you love, I think you'll get a lot out of this episode. Mel, welcome back to Awake in Relationship.
Hi, thanks for having me back, Silas.
So it's been about a year, I think, since our last conversation. You're one of the first. I think you're number 4 back in the spring, and we've gone through a hell of a year. How have you been spending this time?
Yeah, it's been quite a year. I think my own personal journey has been this, a many chaptered arc. There was at first, and Facebook memories reminded me of this today, is that, during the first stage of lockdown, I actually felt a lot of relief of, I have permission to just slow down and do nothing right now. I think I needed that space. And then the summer was a beautiful time of being outdoors a lot and being able to have socially distanced outings with friends to the river. And then fall was a lot of getting cozy. And then winter has sucked.
Amen.
Yeah, I am quite ready for winter to be over.
Yeah. Yeah, well, here on the coast, there's definitely signs that there is hope.
Yeah, I find that, and a lot of people have used this metaphor, that this is the last leg of the marathon, and it's that time where you feel like, I don't know how I'm going to keep going through the rest of this, and somehow you find the stamina to just get through, and the finish line is in sight. One of my partners who is down in California got his first vaccine the other day, which I'm really, really excited about. And it's looking like we'll be able to get our vaccines here in BC sooner than we thought. And so there's a lot of hope on the horizon. And then we get to, I want to say enjoy, but we get to explore what it's going to be in this post-pandemic paradigm.
For those that perhaps didn't tune into our last conversation, maybe share a bit about what you do, and I'm particularly curious. You focus on a very specific kind of community, which you define as honest non-monogamy. What got you interested in that?
Yeah. So I'm a relationship coach, and I specialize in working with people who are exploring honest non-monogamy. So different forms of consensual non-monogamy, including, but not limited to, polyamory and relationship anarchy. And even with that, I feel like I have a niche of, I tend to work with people who are really interested in deconstructing the cultural norms of relating. And figuring out a more authentic, liberating structure to engage in intimate relationships with. So that's the work that I do. And I think, The more I get into this, the more I look at how there's so many different parts of my life that actually led me to this point that I'm not even sure I know how to answer anymore. But I think the catalyst for me was my own journey in non-monogamy. And, I spent the better part of a decade practicing solo polyamory. And I couldn't find any materials about that when I started. I didn't even have the term for that. And so I started writing my own blog, Poly Singlish. And because of the blog, people started reaching out to me and asking for advice. And I was like, I don't feel qualified to give you advice. So I went and got qualified and did training. I have a certification in counseling for intimacy and relationships and have done various other trainings since then. And for, 6 years now, almost, I've been enjoying the process of becoming a relationship coach and working with people all around the world. And it's incredible to see the growth that happens for folks. And I'm always honored and humbled that people choose to work with me.
Are there particular kind of themes that you're noticing with clients in this past year?
The theme that's standing out for me right now at this point is grief. I think during the earlier part of the pandemic, there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of knee-jerk seeking safety reactions that were coming up in relationships. So either people were like, oh, we have to move in together, otherwise we're not going to see each other. And a lot of, or we can't see each other because we don't live together. And a lot of quick shuffling and shifting in relationships. And then it's like we've spent the rest of the year trying to figure out how to reconcile that. And one thing that has been coming up a lot in the last few weeks even is I'm hearing this from clients and I'm hearing this from friends that there's this grief around, oh, we didn't get to have the kind of breakup that I would have liked. Or we de-escalated our relationship, but I wish we could have de-escalated it in a different way. And so there's a lot of sadness that it seems to be getting processed around that. At the same time, I'm noticing that some people have managed to find new relationships during this time and have been able to take the isolation element of the pandemic and use it to their benefit. They've gone deeper into their relationships and felt more connected. So it's really interesting to see this contrast of people being in very different spaces right now.
You've kind of gone into a new kind of area in terms of your professional work. You've been studying somatic sex education. Mm-hmm. I actually had a couple of folks, Michael and Penelope, on not too long ago talking about that. I'm curious how that training has shifted your work.
I mean, I got interested in somatics many, many years ago when I was a body worker. So I did body work and massage professionally for 10 years. And part of my training included a very, very tiny bit of somatics. And somatics is about the mind-body connection. And I got curious about it. And then in my own journey of working through healing my own PTSD, I came across somatic experiencing work and got to have some somatic experiencing sessions that really transformed my experience of my own trauma. And then sort of alongside that, I went to a somatic movement class, and suddenly my experience of my own body changed. And I started to look at all these different pieces, and I was like, these all fit together somehow. How do they fit together? What is it that they're doing for me? And I knew about the somatic sex educator program, but I wasn't sure what it would include. And so I reached out to some of the incredible folks on the faculty who I knew, and they kind of affirmed for me that this was a good place for me to place my attention on next. And, the training is quite intense. I'm only partway into it. And because of the pandemic and not being able to meet up for the in-person components, I'm not as far along with it as I would like to be. And I'll be honest about that. However, doing the work and, diving into the materials, and as a result of doing this training, kind of seeking out everything else I can about somatics, I've found that my awareness has been shifting to much more nuanced understandings of the way that trauma impacts us in our relationships. Because when trauma happens, that's the consequence of our nervous system being overwhelmed by the circumstances that we're in, whether that is just that, things are emotionally overwhelming, or maybe it's physically overwhelming, or maybe it's mentally overwhelming, or maybe it's spiritually overwhelming. And then from there, that overwhelm creates a disconnect within ourselves. And somatics is all about bringing us back into a space of wholeness in ourselves, between mind, body, spirit, and heart. And so taking that approach into my work has been really profound, to start revisiting some of my old materials and go, oh, okay, there's way more happening in the non-monogamous experience that is all about seeking safety than I had even considered before. And so now I get to put that lens into the work that I do with folks.
I think that's kind of a universal need in any relationship, really, is safety.
I like to consider, what if everything that we do as human beings is part of our strategy for safety? Every single thing, whether it is going for a walk or reaching out to connect with a friend or creating something, what if all of these in some way are serving our inner experience of safety in our own existence?
Well, that's probably a good segue into today's conversation, which is about boundaries. How would you define healthy boundaries?
The best metaphor I ever heard for healthy boundaries came from my colleague, Marcia Baczynski, and she said that the skin is an example of a healthy boundary, because the skin keeps out bad things and keeps in good things, but it's still porous. It can allow some things in. So your skin can absorb moisture. Your skin can absorb vitamin D. Your skin will repel dirt and dust. Your skin keeps in your muscles and your blood and your bones. And also the skin has resiliency. The skin has bounce. And this is something very important. We tend to think of boundaries as being this kind of brick wall, or as, when we assert a boundary, that it has to come across as a bulldozer, plowing through against what somebody else wants. But really, boundaries are more like a trampoline, in that, we can have someone push into our boundaries a little bit and be okay. It's like, if I push against your skin, if I remove the pressure, your skin will bounce back. But if I continue to push against your skin, if I never let up, then eventually your skin will bruise or break. And that is the point at which, we experience hurt with our boundaries. And I think that the skill a lot of us have lost or have underdeveloped in ourselves, and this is, I could go on and on about the societal reasons for it, is noticing when someone is pushing against our boundaries. We tend to tune out of it because we've been taught to endure and tolerate so much that we just dissociate from the sense of infringement on our boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it gets normalized in some level.
It does. And, we're taught even as children to not speak up against others. And I'd like to think that that's changing for kids these days, that there's so much more available for them in terms of consent education. But that's not universal. That's not across the board in the whole country or the continent or even the world. And so, going back to what is the definition of boundaries? Boundaries are that which protect ourselves, and they allow in what nourishes us, but they also give us resiliency.
So what would be some red flags that might suggest that, oneself or someone you love has weak boundaries?
I wouldn't I wouldn't say that it's weak boundaries, but I'd say an underdeveloped sense of our own boundaries is maybe a better way to phrase that, because everybody has strong boundaries, I found. And what will happen is if someone has an underdeveloped sense of their boundaries, you don't know until they're freaking out about it. And then it can come across as like, wow, where did that come from? Why are you so upset? But I think the signs that we're not tuned into our boundaries are around, if someone's pushing into somebody's boundaries and they're feeling tired, they're exhausted, they feel mentally overwhelmed. I think about how in my own experience, when I was not wanting to tune into my own boundaries, I would dissociate in conversation. I knew that I had a tendency to sort of go into people-pleasing mode. And that's something that I've seen for quite a lot of folks, because we don't want to question the status quo. We don't want to get into conflict. And so we just go into this like acceptance, and we sort of overcompensate for our discomfort through trying to placate the other person. We might go into a self-sacrificing mode. And for some people, they go to the extreme of being even more self-sacrificing and allowing their boundaries to be even more compromised because they think that that is somehow demonstrating love or affection or care.
So how does trauma affect our ability to kind of articulate and assert our needs and wants in relationship?
The way that it's going to do that for each individual is going to vary slightly, but speaking more generally, when we've experienced trauma in any kind of relational setting, whether that is in our childhood with the caregivers around us, or in adolescence with our peers, or as adults in intimate relationships or communities or friendships, we learn adaptive mechanisms. We get overwhelmed and we go into a kind of reflex response of coping with that trauma. So sometimes that is running away. Sometimes that means shutting down. Sometimes that means we try to fight it and counteract it. Sometimes that means we go into people-pleasing mode. And the specifics of what that look like are different for every different person in every situation. What happens is if we don't get the chance to examine the trauma and integrate the experience of what happened, and I say integrate rather than healing because I think that there's always a bit of scar tissue internally from trauma that can be tender. But if we don't get to integrate that experience, then what happens is in our intimate relationships, the moment something similar shows up, our nervous system, our brain is immediately like, aha, I recognize this pattern. We've been through this before. Quick response team. And we go back into the old pattern. And that is very hard to break the habit. And that's really one of it's very hard to break that habit. And I think this is one of the crucible points of intimate relationships, is learning how to be conscious of what our triggers are and how we're responding to them, and then learning how to separate the story that we're carrying from the past and its impact on us from the reality of what's happening in the present moment.
I think it's pretty common for both men and women, actually, at any stage in a relationship, that one encounters this sort of inner dichotomy between body and mind, where the mind is reaching out for connection, intimacy, but the body is saying no. So how can one kind of begin to kind of work with those somatic experiences to get to the emphatic yes?
I think it's really important to listen to the body. If your body is shutting down, if your body is feeling that fear response, you do need to honor it. One of the principles that I learned from somatic movement is to slow down, and then slow down even more. The slower we go, the more we can tune into the precise sensations. And, we can even do this working with our own body, but this does translate into the emotional work we do. Like if you just do the simple movement of opening and clenching your fist, there are so many micro movements that go on in this action that we perform on a daily basis, multiple times a day. And then if you break it down to just your thumb going in and out, and then you slow it down even further, you start to sense places where you're stiff, places where your joints feel more free. And the more you slow down, the more your mind is able to build a conscious connection with the movement. And in the same way, when we're dealing with trauma responses coming up in our own body, when we're feeling that disconnect between mind and body, we need to slow down. I mean, if you imagine two vehicles traveling and one is going at 120 miles an hour and the other one's going at 40, the one going at 40 is not going to catch up to the other one, and the other one needs to slow down. So we need to really slow down. And in relationship, if one person's having a trauma response, you have to slow down to that person's speed. The more we can slow down and hold space for the minutia of the inner experience, the more we're actually doing to support the healing and integration. Because as we slow down, we start to understand the experience better. And I personally feel like the more we can understand an experience, the more chance we have of integrating it more fully into how we move forward from that.
Yeah, it sounds like a mindfulness practice.
I'd say so, very much so.
Perhaps a lot more fun than meditation. So the nuts and bolts of forming boundaries is really agreements, or what you talk about is agreements in particularly complex relationships. What would be the difference between an agreement and, say, a hard and fast rule?
Well, agreements are about mutuality. It's about coming together with equal understanding, whereas a rule tends to be something that is unilaterally imposed. And this gets tricky because I think in the patriarchal monogamous default that most of us have been raised with, we experience rules being classified as agreements. So we make relationship agreements, but actually it's what one person wants and the other person just agrees to go along with it. There isn't the negotiation, there isn't that space of mutuality. And, negotiating agreements is not easy. I mean, if you think about like peace treaties are a form of agreement. And the reaching mutuality in a peace treaty is not an easy process because everybody has things that they want. The stakes feel really high and you don't want to lose your autonomy because of an agreement. And so when it comes to intimate relationships, we don't want to allow ourselves to fall into spaces of endless conflict. And one of the strategies that we use to avoid conflict is to just go along with what the other person says and just accept the status quo. So if you're making what you think are agreements, but there haven't really been a lot of discussion about it, then it's probably worth exploring. Are we trying to avoid some kind of conflict here? Or maybe we need to brush up on our skills here. I also think that with agreements, an area that it gets tricky to explore in is there are all sorts of implicit agreements that we have culturally. If you and I are sitting down in person, there's a kind of implicit understanding that I'm not going to get up and throw a glass of water in your face or something like that. That's maybe an extreme example, but from culture to culture, the implicit understandings change. And even within subcultures, the agreements, the cultural agreements that exist can be different. And these are all implied. These are all expected that everyone understands. But there's much more beneath the surface of that. And so when you have relationships between people who are coming in from different cultural perspectives, you can't just assume that the implicit understanding is there. And I found that working with my clients who are on the autism spectrum, this also comes up a lot, that the implicit agreements of society around them are not always so obvious. And so there has to be a little more work to break it down. For me, as someone who didn't grow up in Canada, there's still a lot about Canadian culture and North American culture that I find totally baffling, and I don't know if I'll ever understand it.
You're not the only one.
I'm sure there are some Canadians who also feel baffled by it.
For anyone that's in a relationship, even a conventional kind of monogamous relationship, at what point do you think that conversation needs to happen?
Well, with the conversation of agreements, I think there's not a single conversation. It's more like you're having a 4-course meal. There are appetizer agreements, which I think are very important to have at the beginning. And maybe those are more like of just clarifying the understanding around things like sexual health. I might tell people, this is how often I get tested for STIs. These are the sexual health precautions that I use with all my partners, right? Those are more just kind of informing somebody, but maybe there are agreements that come out of that mutual sharing. So very important to have those kind of foundational agreements or appetizer agreements. I think as a relationship develops, then you're going to start exploring more of those like main course or entree agreements, which is going to be more like, okay, well, what are we doing? How often do we see each other? How do we want to connect with each other socially and each other's social circles, and so on and so forth. And then there are kind of occasional agreements that might be circumstantial. I like to call them like seasoning agreements. So they're like side dish agreements, which might be agreements that govern a specific set of circumstances. Like maybe you're both going to a festival and you want to have some agreements around that. Or maybe some people will have had agreements specifically for while they're in lockdown with COVID and the pandemic. Some people might have agreements that are just about, when family's around, we're going to do something different in the way that we present our relationship. And then the sort of 4th course of that was pointed out to me recently is having dessert agreements, which is, having an understanding and agreement around, well, what if this relationship that we're doing doesn't work out the way that we hoped it would? How do we want to continue to engage with each other at the end of the day? And I think that's an important consideration too. And so all of these are things that you can talk about at every stage in a relationship. But I don't think that we need to sort of run into the main course, on your second date. Take one step at a time and move into the agreements as it feels called for. And I think it's good to practice having those conversations early on, even if you don't come to some kind of concrete agreement at the outset.
Are you actually writing these down?
What's that? Oh, writing the agreements down? I think that depends for everybody, what's going to work for you. I think personally, it's helpful to create some kind of written record of the conclusions you come to at the end of a conversation, just for the sake of clarity, if nothing else. And also bear in mind that you have permission to change those agreements. If you find that it's not working, you can renegotiate that. I think that it's really beautiful to look at how you can fashion your agreements into something that reflects your vision for the relationship. And that can be something that in, a long-term relationship or a nesting partnership or an anchor partnership that you create a celebration around. I have a couple of pieces of artwork that I created based on my agreements with one of my partners. And so those sit by my bedside table as a reminder of this is what we're building in our relationship. And this is how we have agreed to show up with each other. So I think that's useful, but at the same time, there's things that I add to that over time. There's things that we may take away from that as things change.
For someone that is in a long-term relationship where there's a lot of unexpressed or unacknowledged expectations, what would be a good first step to starting the process of agreements?
When you're already in a long-term relationship and there's a lot of unexpressed things, I think the first step is to resource yourself with extra support, because that is a process that could bring up a lot of stuff. It could bring up a lot of vulnerability and a lot of fear. And, if you've never voiced what's going on for you, it's probably going to feel very clumsy to do that at the beginning. And that clumsiness is totally okay. However, the clumsiness and the fear of being clumsy can make us so afraid that we go back into a trauma response kind of place. And so to resource yourself externally, whether that is with a counselor or a coach, or even just, a sympathetic friend, that you can bounce ideas around with first, I think is a really good idea before you are able to bring them to your partner. And to invite your partner to do the same thing. I think that, the process of coming into agreements, the first step is we have to really know ourselves. We have to be clear on our own boundaries and our own desires and our own capacity. And that is an intense amount of self-work, especially when we live in a society that tells us we're not allowed to have boundaries, and that having desires is selfish, and that having limitations in our capacity is not allowed. So, there is a tremendous amount of self-work that needs to be done there. And I don't think that you get as far doing that alone versus if you do that with support. And once you've been able to do that with support in the process of talking with your partner about it, you might find that the two of you need external support as well.
So zooming out after the year we've just had, what sort of opportunities for intimacy and connection do you see going forward in the post-pandemic world?
Oh, it's going to be interesting. I know that there have been a lot of predictions that we're going to have a renaissance, or it's going to be the roaring 20s again. But I know that a lot of people I've talked to don't want to find themselves in a mosh pit of human beings anytime soon. I think it's going to be a more slow process for some. I don't doubt that there are going to be people who will kind of work hard to make up for the lost time of the past year. And I'm sure we're going to see a kind of, I feel sure that we're going to see an increase in STI rates and sexual health concerns over the coming year, as people kind of are able to get out there and explore. And, it's that thing of, when you're so hungry and you go grocery shopping, you're not necessarily making all the best decisions. You're not really thinking through what you're putting in your cart. I have a feeling that there may be an element of that happens for a time. What I'm hopeful is that the time we've had during this pandemic to do self-examination and to deepen our connections in our existing relationships, including friendships and family connections, or maybe distance ourselves in some relationships with friends and families, as the case may be. I'm hoping that work supports people to be making more conscious choices in the future. I think that the nature of online dating is going to change. I'm hoping that we go back to more of a slower process, more getting to know each other. I've seen that happen already through the pandemic, just because of the COVID safety measures. People are taking more time to talk online and video chat before actually meeting up in person. And I don't think that process is going to just evaporate. I think a lot of people have found that has helped them feel safer in their connections. And hopefully we continue that. In terms of, the ways that communities connect, I don't know how that's going to go. I've seen so many communities feel fractured through this, through misinformation or differences in approaches to the severity of the pandemic and the safety measures. And I suspect that there's still going to be a sense of grief for a few years as people reconcile losing some communities and losing some relationships and having to renegotiate how they engage with people based on what happened during the pandemic.
Well, Mel, it's been a great conversation. Thank you again. And how can people find out more about what you do?
Yeah. So the best way to get in touch with me is to go visit my website. It's radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca. You can also find me on social media on Instagram and Facebook at Radical Relating. I post on Instagram and Facebook fairly regularly, and you can also message me through those channels too. And then I have been offering various courses online through the pandemic as introductions to non-monogamy, including some of the basic skills like boundaries and agreements. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, make sure you do go to my website and sign up for my mailing list so that you can stay informed about when those are happening again.
Thank you again to Mel for this conversation. I always learn so much when I get a chance to speak with her. If you want to learn more about her work and courses, head over to radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca. You can also check out the show notes at awakenrelationship.com, where I'll post some links. While there, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. And if you have a moment and you found this episode helpful, I'd really appreciate a brief review on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps me to grow this show. So thank you again, dear listener, for tuning in. Stay safe and stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.